I think we're live. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the first presentation of the day. First off, I want to thank CBP and Andrew for getting Country Malt and the team back together to do a presentation on a new topic. This time around, we're going to be talking about hazy IPAs, malts and adjuncts, and although it doesn't say it in the presentation, we have a couple really cool case studies at the end that will also bring in constituents, recipes, recipe development associated with yeast and hops and all that good stuff as well, brewery processing as well. So with me today is Grant Lawrence. My name is Tyler Schoales. 14 years in the malting industry now, ranging from lab specialist all the way through to sales manager, and now I'm a malt specialist, North American craft for Country Malt Group. And Grant, you want to just say a couple things about?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Tyler. Long time home brewer. Got into professional brewing about 10 years ago. Did that for a number of years at a large regional brewery here in Texas, and been with Country Malt now going on four and a half years, and doing IBD certifications and all that. So Tyler asked me to join in on this presentation.
Great. All right. So without waiting any longer, we're going to jump to the next screen here and we're going to start going through what we're going to be talking about today. So first and foremost, we're going to define the characteristics of a successful hazy. You know, what does that mean? What does it look like? What does it smell like? What does it feel like when you're drinking it? All of that good stuff. We're going to coin a new phrase for those of you that haven't heard it before. I'm sure that will spark some interest and trend a little bit afterwards, I hope. And then we're going to talk about definitions and processing of malts and adjuncts. Why do we malt? Why do we process adjuncts? What characteristics do the raw ingredients have? What characteristics do the processed ingredients have? And then talk a little bit about the building blocks for a successful hazy. And then lastly, we're going to talk about a couple really cool case studies. We have 4 breweries that we queried, and they were thrilled to share their best practices with us. So we're going to compare and contrast those 4 breweries and hopefully give you some take-home advice for creating that hazy down the road. All right, so appearing in the hazies, we'll start with the Perfect Hazy. You know, what does it look like to everybody? Grant's going to kick it off.
Sure. This is probably not new news to anybody, I would hope, at this point, but hazy IPAs continue to have a huge presence across North America craft. Some breweries brew them almost exclusively, it seems. And brewers need a source of turbidity for their hazy IPAs and sours, really. And that can come from a couple different sources: hop polyphenols, hop oils, from the vegetative matter of the plants themselves, whether they're malts or hops. So plant tannins, and in the grist components, mid-molecular weight protein constituents. One of the reasons why we wanted to present on this is that the North American supply on flaked grain is becoming strained. It kind of has been becoming, but it was strained in the past as well. There's really not that many flaking operations in the U.S. Or in North America in general at the moment.
Perfect. Next slide, Grant.
So the Perfect Hazy. What is the Perfect Hazy? Over the past few years, there's been some style guideline additions, BJCP for home brewing, but also in World Beer Cup and GABF. One of the things, and Tyler totally, this is Tyler's term, and it was just perfect, is for the color for a good hazy. For what we're seeing people wanting is, we want it hazy, not grazy, as we're calling it. If you want to think about grazy, this is a picture of a good hazy, right? It's nice, it's bright, almost looks like some kind of orange juice. Doesn't look like almond milk. It's not grazy. So straw to deep gold with bright hue. In terms of malt aroma, you want minimal malt aroma, medium high to high hop aroma and flavor. And you want it very fruity, very fruit ester forward, contributed by hops and yeasts. In terms of bitterness, that's with this style, you really want no lingering hop burn. No, you kind of want that hop bitterness to come on and then fall off, and not hang around like a classic West Coast IPA. And then for the body, they're kind of thick. You want silky, full mouth feel, but you walk the line. You don't really want cloying sweetness. I know there's some of these lactose beers now, but I guess traditionally, right, as of a few years ago, you didn't want it to be cloyingly sweet.
Yeah.
Slide.
All right. So when we move into the mystery of the stable haze, I think it's important to note a couple of things before we progress into how to create it. So first off, brewers are obviously looking for haze which is stable in package, and we're going to try focus on stability in package today. That's important. It's difficult to do, and it can be hit or miss with the brews that you're putting through your brewery. Second point that's really important is maltsters focus on creating malt that yields clear wort, not haze. So traditionally, maltsters aren't going for haze. They still are not going for haze in most cases. Base malt is a base malt that can be applied to multiple beer styles and not just one in the hazy. So keep that in mind when you're talking with your maltster and you're chatting about the loss of haze in your beer and you're wondering how you can get more. Well, a maltster isn't intending to put haze into a base malt. They're trying to put haze into specialty malts and adjuncts that can build the proper building blocks for a stable haze in your beer, but not that base malt. So third point we want to make, and we're going to reiterate this quite a bit, is creating and maintaining haze specific to each brewery. And what you're going to see in the case studies today, without spoiling it early on, is that everybody does it a little bit different. And it's very, very obvious that there isn't a smoking gun that gives everybody the stable haze, or everyone would have that stable haze right from the get-go by mimicking one of the leaders in the industry. So keep that in mind. This is a work in progress in everyone's brewery. It's painful until you get to the end goal. You're ever adapting to improve. However, it is specific to every single brewery, so you can't just follow a strict recipe and get there. And then some strategies to develop haze with malt and adjuncts. We're going to cover a couple of these today, focusing in on things like dextrin malts, chit malts, oats are a big deal. We're going to talk about why malted or flaked. Wheat, same thing. Spelt malt. Here are the last 2 points I will make. You can create haze by making mistakes. Poor brewhouse performance or lack of control of your brewhouse can create haze, or any kind of lack of proper filtration or lack of proper fermentation can produce forms of haze. And then crop year. We go year to year. We apply and we use an ingredient from Mother Nature. So in the event that ingredient doesn't suit the bill in the malting world across North America, well, we're going to have some adverse effects when it comes to malting it. And then the specifications that we are able to create after malting it won't suit the bill for a clear beer. We can create a hazy beer that way as well. And that is not by design. Like I said, up above, maltsters are looking for that base malt to contribute, no haze at all, so that we can build off of that to create haze. So the types of haze, like we said, have long been considered a beer flaw, but there are some exceptions, and this type of beer style is one of them. Many craft brewers nowadays try to create these hazy products, and many craft consumers now consider it a quality measure, a mark of quality. How good is the hazy at the beer pub or location that I'm going to? So go figure. We've done full circle. And now we're getting marked. Brewers are getting marked on how good their hazy is versus how good their lager is. Types of haze common in beer are typically derived from protein, polyphenol, starch, or microbial. And haze and turbidity is a quality parameter, no different than any other parameter. Such it should be measured and understood. So how do we understand it? How do we try to establish what we have before we develop it any further? Well, first you have to determine the type of haze it is. And we've got a couple of different ways of determining what type of haze that you have in your beer already before you add to it and create that stable haze that you're after for your hazy. One is microscopic evaluation with hemocetometer. And this is the old school way of doing things. We've come up with a couple new ideas as of late. Caustic dissolvability test has been talked about quite a bit in quite a few presentations on hazies as of late. Sodium hydroxide drops into a sample, causes the haze to clear, which means it's most likely of protein derivatives, and it has permanent haze viability when that happens. And then if you were to have the ability to centrifuge out some of the small microbial sample or the haze itself out of that sample, well, you've got 4 different staining mechanisms that you can try establish and link with specific molecules. So eosin yellow, staining protein, beta-glucan being stained by Congo red, starch is your iodine test, and then pentasans with staining with thionine. So if all else fails and you really want to get to know your haze, outside testing is probably a viable source of gaining that knowledge. So when we get into malt and adjuncts, sourcing of haze within your beer, there's a lot to talk about. We're going to try rip through it. And of course, if there's questions at the end, we'll take them. And if there are no questions right away, we'll be available via email as well. So what types of ingredients are we talking about here when we talk about sources of haze? Aside from hops and yeast, keep that in mind. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. From a recipe development standpoint, all of the query breweries that we have data on now, all tend to lean towards 70–80% of the recipe being malted barley or a base malt of some kind. And when I say base malt, lots of people think that, you know, malted wheat could fall into the category of a base malt or something similar to a base malt. We've slotted it with adjuncts today simply because, you know, 20–30% of that bill is going to be of adjunct kind of descendant, and wheat kind of falls in that 20–30% when we're talking about recipe development. When we talk about adjuncts, we have raw ingredients, we have malted wheat, malted oats, flake products, toasted products. Like mentioned in previous slides, we've got dextrin malts, spelt malts, chit malts that also contribute noticeable haze, and we're going to talk about why here in a second. So first off, we're going to dig into malted ingredients. Why malt raw ingredients? What's the purpose? It's really important to note that a lot of the building blocks for haze are mid-molecular weight proteins, and in order to get, you know, some breakdown and some modification of the total protein, the intact protein, it's got to go through some form of mechanical breakdown, biomechanical breakdown. So malt, raw ingredient barley comes into the plant, and our objective as maltsters is to enzymatically break down that kernel to ensure that it's friable, it's useful for brewers and distillers. The enzymes are synthesized or unbound, and the starch is accessible in free-flowing extract. So maltsters emulate Mother Nature to do this by tricking the kernel into enzymatically breaking down or modifying the endosperm. And I like to lay it out in 3 different stages. 1, steeping, emulating spring conditions, heavy rainfalls, lots of water, lots of moisture uptake, getting the kernel to about 27% first immersion and about 45% second immersion. Really important in the activation of the embryo and the release of specific gibberellins to activate this biomechanical breakdown of the endosperm. Second stage, summer growing conditions, is where we apply a little bit less water, but we take the active embryo and kernel at this point and trick it into growing to the point where it's about to take on photosynthetic traits, but we stop it dead in its tracks with kilning, because if it goes into photosynthesis mode and it starts growing green leaves and producing chlorophyll and all that good stuff, well, we've gone too far, and now that endosperm, that starch reserve, is being used to grow the plant rather than be intact for the brewer downstream. And during the kilning process, we stop it and put it in stasis, dead in its tracks, all the while trying to preserve as much enzymatic activity as we can in diastatic power, which is which is part of the overarching set of enzymes with alpha amylase, beta amylase, limit dextranase, all of those good things, all of those enzymes that you need in order to break down those starches into simple sugars for the yeast to act on. Anything to add on that, Grant? How we doing?
No, I think you pretty much nailed it there. I'm going to let you do the Maltster side, and I'll pick up on the brewing side as we get further along.
Perfect. All right. So malt is a source of haze. It's really important we take a look at malted versus unmalted barley, and I pulled out a couple of really key characteristics in a malt COA of barley versus malted barley that I think are relevant here. Note that starch content tends to go down, but sucrose and other sugars, all important sugars, simple sugars, tend to go up. Also note that hemicelluloses, building blocks of cell wall, plant cell wall, tend to go down as well. They're broken down into smaller constituents. Protein or different types of prolamines, the protein content stays stable throughout the process, but is broken down into specific smaller constituents. And you'll note that free amino nitrogens go up, peptides go up, portine goes up, glutenin goes up, globulin goes up, albumin goes up, or goes down. So there's a really important transition between protein content being broken down and what you're able to do as far as creating stable haze is concerned. And then minerals and others down the bottom staying fairly stable throughout the process. Nothing's added, nothing subtracted from the malting process. I will note that on the other side of the spectrum, there are enzymatic constituents, amylases, dextrinases, proteases, glucanases that are all created, synthesized, or unbound during this process, which is really important to the overall brewing process. But for the sake of haze generation, we're going to be focusing on, protein specifically, and maybe some cell wall as well, some cell wall degradation as well. So key benefits to malting grains. Malted grains, starch and protein matrices have been modified. They've been broken down. Naturally present enzymes have been developed, synthesized, and preserved. Amylases, dextrinases, all part of the equation. Cell walls have been broken down, reduced sub 150 in the form of base malts. And then with specialty malts, you'll see there's a little bit of a increase in beta-glucan, which could contribute to some of the haze that you're after, mouthfeel, head retention that you're after with some higher beta-glucan dextrin malts. Grain has been extensively cleaned during this process mechanically in the form of shakers and sieve analysis and sorting, going through aspiration, of course, through water, dousing it in water and rinsing it in water through the steeping process, through forms of heat in the kiln, where we're bringing it up to 85 degrees Celsius or greater to kill off anything that's in there that shouldn't be in there. And then, of course, air passing through the grain afterward through aspiration once again to clean it up for one last trip to the brewery. And then, of course, benefits of malted grains, you can't go without mentioning that flavor has been greatly refined and built up. It's no longer that grassy, grainy kernel that you're expecting, and it now has non-enzymatic browning effect to it. Aroma and flavor has been created through the Maillard reaction. So on the adjunct front, there's some processing that's involved as well. Maybe a little bit less substantial than the malting process. We're not going through an entire biochemical breakdown of kernel, but we are going through some important steps. For the raw kernels, we're going through sorted and cleaned. Seeds of various grasses are appropriate for production of alcohol via fermentation. So there's a number of different ingredient streams that can be sourced as raw. Starch and protein in these raw ingredients is typically insoluble and bound by a complex matrix. They're requiring the addition of enzymes to break down this can be a little bit of a deterrent if you're not using a lot of DP and alpha driven ingredients beyond the raw ingredients that you're putting into your mix. So there's very negligible enzyme content in raw ingredients, and then beta-glucan in small grains is quite a bit higher than that of anything that's been processed. On the flake front, flake products go through pre-gelatinization. They're sorted, cleaned as a raw ingredient stream. They're heated with some moisture added They're mechanically rolled, moisture is driven out of the flake product, temperature is dropped so it doesn't sweat within the bin, and away you go. And toasted takes that one step further and goes through additional heating steps to create additional Maillard reactions and creation of additional flavor. I will note that flake products and toasted products, any of these adjuncts, tend to carry with them higher moisture content. So a little tip, a little advice point that I can draw upon when talking about flake products is they're typically around 12 to 14%. They don't store as long as malted ingredients, and it's important to note that because that higher percentage of moisture can lead to infestation, pests, and improper storage, rancid characteristics developing in a shorter period of time. So keep that in mind when you're bringing in flake to your brewery. As far as what's happening during the flaking process, it's important to note that each flake product, regardless of what type of ingredient stream is coming into the flaking facility, has to go through a form of gelatinization, and every single raw unmalted grain has different gelatinization temperatures. So each product has its own target gelatinization temperature, and processes are catered to hit that gelatinization temperature. Overshooting that before we hit rolling or flaking, the grain becomes almost too pliable, liquid-like, and creates quite the mess. Undershooting it, the gelatinization temperature, we don't get to the point where it's pliable enough, and that in essence creates a shattering effect when it goes to the flaking facility. So it's important that whoever is creating these forms of flake products knows the products, the ingredient stream coming in, and is properly gelatinizing or coming very close to gelatinization temperatures prior to going through their rolling facility. The other things that come with adjuncts that are listed as quantifiable, measurable details are listed on this chart above or beside. One thing to note that there are qualitative contributions that are also present in adjuncts. So from a quantitative standpoint, you'll note that beta-glucan is one of the keys contributing factors that we're focusing in on. And you can see that different ingredient streams, rye, oats, and rice, in raw form have varying degrees of beta-glucan. You'll note that oats has a very, very high beta-glucan content, rye, above 1,000, but not like barley. Barley can go into the 3,000s as well. Rice, negligible, hence why it's used the way it's used. Flaked wheat, torrefied wheat, and flaked barley, you could see barley being the highest beta-glucan bomb that you can have next to oats. So you can see that these beta-glucan levels vary from ingredient stream to ingredient stream, and it's important to note that these could be contributing some form of haze, although most likely beta-glucan haze not being stable throughout the entire process and packaging. So the other thing to note here is that when we are dealing with ingredients that have been partially modified, like dextrin malts and chit malts, that beta-glucan hit on barley comes down to around anywhere from 500 to about 1,500, kind of splitting the middle of rye and oats in raw form. So there are varying degrees of beta-glucan in samples. It's important to identify these before including them in your recipe and understand the ingredient that you're using. From a qualitative standpoint, people tend to lean on malted wheat as the most widely used adjunct. It carries with it full body, bready, doughy flavor contributions, really beautiful flavor profile if used correctly. Malted rye, typically darker color contributor, associated with golden color formation leaning towards orangish color hues. Strong flavor presence with rye, sometimes too dominant, spiced, bready, biscuity character associated with that. And then malted oats, great enhancer of body of the beer and head retention, contributes a really velvety kind of texture and smoothness to finished beers upon inclusion. And that's really important for hazies, and that's why it's used fairly frequently when creating recipes for hazies. There's very little flavor contribution when it comes to oat malt, unless it's used 100% of the way through. And Grant has experienced it in Texas, where he experienced 100% oat malt beer. bit of a detail of what
Yeah,
it
it was actually, you know, at the time it was one of my one of the people I worked with in Arizona, one of my customers out there, and he did a 100% oat malt beer just to see what would happen, you know, see if it would actually be, you know, this super thick thing like we would all picture, right? But it wasn't, you know, and it had kind of a milky color to it, and this kind of this oatmeal cookie like flavor, but yeah, it definitely wasn't what you would expect, but it was really neat proof of concept of doing a 100% oat malt beer, and he had to use some rice hulls in it, but you know, not as much as you would think. Oat malts have a great husk on them, so it really worked for him. It was just kind of a neat one-off thing that you don't see that often.
Cool. Thanks, Grant. So, you know, finally, when we talk about flake products, we're talking about fairly raw ingredients that haven't gone through substantial amount of processing. So these raw ingredients, like we said, hit gelatinization temperature, are quickly rolled out thereafter, and then, you know, dried off and cooled down. Typically, these raw ingredients going through the flake process are a little less sweet. They taste pretty starchy, grassy, grainy in general. So, you know, keep that in mind when you're adding them to the mix, and you're going to see from a constituent of the recipe standpoint, Grant's got some ideas later on in the presentation. So, you know, we dig in how processing is done with adjuncts. What are the key benefits of using adjuncts? Well, in the raw front, they're an inexpensive source of carbohydrates. However, typically further processing is required. Some beer styles can include raw ingredients. Of note, raw ingredients are really, really difficult to mill, difficult on rollers. They have poor storage due to higher moisture. And since there's no kilning, there's no kiln cleaning or heat clean either. Preferably, raw ingredients are put through a hammer mill. Otherwise, you're going to run into some rough days of milling these ingredients through rollers. But in some instances in the craft world, we know that these raw ingredients do go through rollers. You just got to, you know, anticipate it's going to take a little longer, and there's going to be some heartache when you're putting it through those roller systems. Go ahead.
I don't want to cut you off here, but can you elaborate a little bit for the group on that kind of that kill step, if you will, of on the raw ingredients where they're not being kilned, they're not being rolled, there's no heat?
Yeah, sure. So with raw ingredients, when you kiln things, obviously you're bringing it up in temperature, and you're applying quite substantial heat source. You know, in most cases, if you apply that heat source to any ingredient stream that's gone through modification, you're going to create some beautiful flavor, color development. You're going to use those fans and precursors to drive flavor generation kind of pathways. On raw ingredients, you don't get that nearly as much. There's nothing that's been broken down. Cell walls still intact, protein content still intact, protein matrices, that is, and starch hasn't been broken down to simple sugar. So you don't have the constituents for the Maillard reaction to occur on a non-enzymatic level. However, flake barley or black barley or roasted barley is made in this exact way. But with no kilning, you're not driving down moisture content. And I think what Grant's getting at is lower moisture content establishes better storage capabilities. Anything below, say, 8% moisture, and you're looking like it could store a lot longer. And that kilning step also tends to kill off, you know, any kind of contaminants that are in there, any kind of insects that have gone through the farming process and made it through the sorting process. Those die off as well. They can't handle the heat. So they get out of the kitchen quite quickly, and it just stores a lot better that way. From a malting perspective, malted malts are efficient, self-converting, accessible starch is readily available, and generally as a husk, it has a husk, not in the case of wheat, but it does have a husk, which promotes better lautering performance. On the flake front, starches are pre-gelatinized and soluble, much easier to use, no need to cook them. They do contribute fairly substantial foam and mouthfeel. There is a moderate increase when using these flake products in final gravities, and flavor benefits of raw ingredients are minimal. You know, we don't see a lot of flavor generation when using flake products. So in essence, they're easy to use, no need to mill. they contribute everything you want to contribute, and they could form, and we're going to talk about this in a second, some pretty spectacular haze when added to a recipe development stage. So in summary, we put this chart up here. I think this chart is really important, kind of highlighting some of the details we're leaning on as far as mid-molecular weight proteins are concerned, but we'll go through the summary details on the left here before we dig into that. So processing a malt is very important when supporting stable haze. Modification of the protein wall, protein and cell wall is pretty vital to the success of creating haze. You want cell wall to be broken down so it's usable in the brewery and not clogging filters and causing beta-glucan haze that isn't stable. Modification of protein broken down into smaller constituents and mid-molecular protein sizes is really important. We're going to touch on that in just a second. And flavor generation, of course, is important as well. From the adjunct front, it's also very important for creating stability in haze and final beer. You do have unmodified protein content, and depending on the adjunct you use and the grain type that's coming into the brewery, you have different prolamines of varying molecular weights that could promote the most ideal haze when we're talking about final product. And then finally, ratio of base malt to adjunct is consistent with the breweries queried. So when we look at this graph on the right here, you're going to note a couple of things. This was done on a flour, done in an abstract. It was pulled out of an abstract for a flour study, but it does carry with it some weight, and it does highlight the different prolamines that are present in different types of grain. So wheat having glidins, rye having secalins, barley having hordeins, oats having avenins. These are all different prolamines that could contribute to your haze, and you can see that the proportions in molecular weights change depending on the type of prolamine that we're talking about in that type of grain. That said, when researching successful executed hazies, hazy IPAs with our queried case studies and abroad when we go walking around and touring around talking about hazies, we found that one thing that was in common with the majority of recipes: a base malt plus multiple adjuncts and high total hop load equals successful hazy contribution and stable haze. So focusing in on the malts and adjuncts that we have here, you'll see that each type of grain carries the different prolamines and a spread on molecular weight, the size of the proteins that are being used to create the polypeptide polyphenol bonds and that stable haze. So if you have more types of prolamines and different molecular weight prolamines available to create those bonds, there is a better chance of producing a more stable haze and those bonds between tannins and prolamines to be formed. So looking at this, the takeaway for us and the takeaway for a brewer will be the more things you can throw at a hazy without going overboard, the better off you're going to be in creating these stable hazes, because you're utilizing different molecular weight prolamines for this polypeptide polyphenol bonding to occur. So that takes us through the malting side of things, adjunct processing, malt processing. Now is the fun part. Grant gets to take care of the rest. He's going to be talking about the case studies that we had. We will note that these breweries are leaders of the pack in our eyes as far as hazy development is concerned. So keep that in mind. Also keep in mind that everybody's different in each recipe development. Each brewery is going to produce hazy in a different way, slightly different way throughout, but there are some commonalities. So Grant, take it away.
Sure thing. Yeah, as Tyler was saying, basically we just pulled together a bunch of best practices from our queried breweries. Most of them are regional, or in some cases there's a few national breweries that we'd like to thank for giving us all their background info on what they do for their successful hazy brands. So I wanted to start off with water, just going in the order of brewing, right? So what's the first thing you got to worry about is water. While the ratio may change, all of our queried brewers recommended a higher chloride to sulfate ratio. So, I guess by the book, leaning a little bit more malty. Oftentimes it was mentioned as high as 3 to 1. was frequently discussed as the ideal. However, and what you're seeing from this nice easy water calc that one of them supplied us, you can be very successful with a lower chloride to sulfate ratio while still leaning chloride heavy, right? It was also mentioned more than once across the breweries we talked to that too high of a calcium can be negative to haze and can negatively impact having a stable haze. We keep saying stable in this presentation because it's one thing to have, haze in the bright tank or out of the fermenter, but it's another thing to have it a few months down the road, like off the shelf. So I think that's the real crux of the issue is it's one thing to get haze and it's another thing to get stable haze. So with the calcium, the numbers jumped around a bit, but didn't have any kind of consensus on the exact ppm of too high of a calcium, but it was just mentioned more than once, so we thought we would put it in the presentation. It was also said one way to keep your calcium low while still having a high chloride to sulfate ratio is to use an Epsom salt or magnesium sulfate to keep the calcium in check. So this easy water calc, it's a great program for doing your water chemistry. I believe it's free. It used to be free. I don't know. Those guys deserve a beer or I don't know, a donation at least for all they've done with this easy water calc. I think it's been around for at least a decade. I used to use this home brewing way back when. But you can see here in the table, this is a very, it still leans chloride heavy, but it's not 3-to-1. It's 1.24-to-1 is the ratio. So this was from one of our successful breweries, and we'll get to that later with a kind of a more advanced chart. But for now, I'll go on to the next slide. So malt and adjuncts. One thing was very clear, as Tyler mentioned, 70 to 80% base malt is what you want for your hazy, and then 20 to 30% adjuncts. You can debate whether or not malted wheat is an adjunct, but for the case of this, at least for this presentation, just to keep it clean, we're going to throw that in the adjunct category. So inclusion of multiple adjuncts to improve haze stability. Malted and flaked oats, unmalted malted wheat, chit malt, spelt malt, which is one that many people aren't familiar with, chit and spelt really, and flaked barley. As Tyler mentioned, the type and size of proteins is really important to hold the suspension of haze over time. And from the breweries we talked to, there isn't a single brewery that uses only one type of adjunct, one type of high protein grain to get their stable haze. They all use at least two. Another common misconception is that you need a Pilsner malt or a two-row, something that me and Tyler see a lot of breweries go to is they're going lighter and getting away from a pale malt. That's not necessarily the case. Some of the breweries we talk to, they love to use a pale in their hazy, and it still looks just as bright. Doesn't kind of ruin that color perception that we talked about earlier in this presentation. So for yeast, most commonly you see brewers use London Ale 3 from Yeast or London Fog or BSI Conan. They're all kind of considered the same strain. I realize that yeast strains from different yeast manufacturers, they're going to be slightly different, but for this, they're kind of considered to be the same strain. So those three that I just mentioned, they're relatively low flocculating, and they are they're low flocculating and they're very fruity flavored. So some strategies to consider around yeast. Yeast strains differ in their ability to flocculate. Increased calcium promotes flocculation, which kind of goes back to that prior slide. During flocculation and sedimentation, yeast can act as finings. So as yeast ages, it can actually become more flocculent. So right here, you're seeing from this study, generation 1 to generation 9, big range in flocculation. So really, you don't want to rely on yeast as a stable form of haze. You want to get those fruity esters from it and get it out of your finished product for a better shelf life.
I could also add here, Grant, just taking
Sure.
over for a quick second, that as yeast sits and interacts further down in fermentation, day 4, day 5 after fermentation is set, finishing up, daughter cells typically adhere to mother cells and create this gooey kind of gummy kind of character to them, and that will typically, if still present in suspension, will stick to all sorts of stuff, all of the other things in suspension. So one thing to note with all of our case study breweries is that no matter if they dry hop early or not, there's always a late addition hop post yeast flock and harvesting, because they know that these daughter cells adhering to mother cells and creating this gummy kind of sticky substance,
Yeast goober
can really pull out any haze that you've created in your brewing process or hop process. We good to move on, Grant?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay. Perfect. All right.
Yeah, gotta get to the fun case study part that I know everybody's waiting on. So for hops, pretty variable hop rate, but still very heavy on hops. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone here. 4 to 7 pounds was what we were seeing across the case studies. Those big aromas and flavors that we associate with a great hazy IPA, many breweries, you just can't get it if you go less than that. It's difficult, as much as they would like to with the price of hops these days. So the hopping regime was different for everybody. Commonalities were that there was minimal to no bittering hops, and there was a very heavy whirlpool addition. So they're getting all their bittering from that late whirlpool addition, and then on top of that, a very large dry hop. For the dry hop, breweries approached it in different ways. As most of y'all have probably heard, the biotransformation thing, it was tough. Some brewers said that it didn't seem to matter for them, and then others really stood by it and said that biotransformation helped them get a stable haze. So we wanted to list both ways here. And lastly, using cryohops in conjunction with T90. So, T90s were in all of them, but there were cryohops as well. For those unfamiliar with cryohops are what I would group in terms of vegetative matter reduced hop products. There's other ones out there besides just cryo. But by removing the brat or the vegetative matter from the hops, the hop pellets, you're going to get a better yield. And something like these hazy IPAs that use 4 to 7 pounds per barrel, that's pretty key. You're going to waste a lot of beer if you're not using or integrating some kind of vegetative matter reduced hop product.
Cool.
Anything, Tyler?
No, I think we're good on the hop front. We've got a couple minutes left, and the last slide kind of sums it all together with some really interesting brewery techniques. So kick her off, and we'll do some comparison of the case studies.
Absolutely. We're probably going to spend some time on the slide because it's pretty busy, as you can see. So, here's 4 of the breweries that we chatted to. All have very successful, sought after hazy beers. Brewery A, I'll start out with, is when you look at this chart, it's kind of an outlier, but interesting all the same. So not as high, kind of a lower chloride to sulfate ratio. The malt adjunct contribution is percentage wise is similar to the other ones, but the interesting part of it is they like spelt malt for their haze. So if you're not familiar with spelt is a kind of an antique wheat. It's related to wheat, similar grain, just a really ancient wheat variety. And that is what they like for getting their haze. So 30% adjunct contribution in addition to their base malt. And of that, 2-to-1 spelt to white wheat is what they like. And then perhaps more interesting is the Irish ale yeast that they like. They like the Irish ale yeast because it's a high flocculating yeast and it's fruity. It can make a fruity flavor when fermented at a higher temperature. And then when it comes to their dry hopping, their hopping practices, they don't do any whirlpool hops. They knock out onto hops in the fermenter, which is pretty wild. At 4 to 7 pounds per barrels total. So I believe they have another dry hop step after that, but their whirlpool part is knocking out onto hops.
So one other thing to add here, and we didn't put it in here, is that when they knock out on the hops with no whirlpool addition, there is some hot liquid in the mix. There's about 2 or 3 minutes of transfer that's hot liquid that's going onto the hops. Before we start to see the cooler temperatures kick in. So they tend to get their bitterness and the subtle bitterness that people get from whirlpool with that slight amount of hot liquid from kettle to fermentation tank and knocking out onto those hops.
Absolutely. Really neat take on things that I had never thought of, but it works for them. Let's doing some comparisons here. Brewery B and D are very similar to each other. The high chloride to sulfate ratio. Some of the differences between the two are just what they choose for adjuncts, right? So Brewery B likes flaked wheat and flaked oats and white wheat, kind of a grab bag there. 3 different ones. And Brewery D likes oat malt and white wheat is what they found to be successful. So very similar. And then again, the yeast similarities, London Ale 3 versus London Fog. So many people kind of consider those to be the same strain. And then when it comes to their hops, large whirlpool addition, dry hop afterwards, similar amounts. So Brewery B and D, I would say, is probably the most similar from the breweries we surveyed. When it comes to Brewery A and C, both of those prefer the high flocculating yeast. You'll see that California Ale, the reasons they gave for this is they can turn tanks faster with these high flock yeasts and still get their haze. Kind of the I say traditional here, within the last 5 years, right, with this style of beer. London Ale 3 and London Fog, which are they're relatively slow. They can't really be rushed, those yeast strains, and our brewery supported that here. They said they're 20-25 day beers with those yeasts, whereas the other 2 yeasts can move through quite a bit faster, turn the tank over. More tank turns is more money in brewers' pockets. Well, really, the bottom line that we wanted to get at with this study, and I think Tyler already nailed it, was there's many different ways to do a successful hazy, but the key takeaways are that the grist composition is pretty clear, and that you really want to use more than one adjunct, something with a medium level of modification. From that chart prior, you want really a mixture of all the different malt and adjunct related proteins, different molecular weights. Less clear, but we can generalize here. You want water with a high chloride to sulfate ratio and a boatload of hops in the whirlpool and the dry hop. It's even less clear, I would say, from this study, but which yeast? Seems like you can successfully do it with a high flocculating or a low flocculating strain. All of the breweries did mention, though, fermenting warmer and trying to get more fruity flavors from their yeast, though. You have anything else to add, Tyler?
Not too much. I just can't stress enough the importance of, each brewery doing it their own way. We get phone calls on a regular basis about, with people trying to ID the best way to create stable haze. And the one thing that we always come back to is ensuring that your recipe is robust enough to give you the best chances of getting there. And that means, like Grant said, that 20 to 30% adjunct contribution has to be multiple product streams going into it. The yeast is a very interesting case that, you know, if it's not flocked out before you add that last addition of dry hopping, that gumminess of the yeast, the goober, can pull a lot of that out. So there was a consensus across the board that a late addition post early yeast crop dry hop was very, very important to the process and creating that stable yeast. So yeah, in general, there's no true answer that's going to get you hazy, a stable haze every single time at every brewery. I think people need to understand that their systems, their processes, their ingredient streams all contribute, and everyone is different. But at the same time, there's some underlying commonalities that you can rely on to get you on the right path. And then it's up to you to kind of tweak the rest of the way out to make sure that you get that stable haze you're after. So with that said, I think, you know, we're running short on time, but I'm sure we'll be able to get some questions coming our way via email after the fact. I've been asked if we could share this slide deck. We'll talk to Andrew about getting it up on some form of CBP website to get downloads available. I thank the CBP very, very, very much for allowing us to speak on this cool topic. Grant and I are thrilled that we were invited to do this Haze presentation, and we couldn't be more thankful for the CBP for putting something like this on in these times. So appreciate all the feedback. We're going to read through it. We'll get to the questions, and thanks again, everyone, for attending.
Thanks for having us.